Hello and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink, and welcome to the final episode in our series Flash in the Can, the one-hit wonders of cult cinema. Today we'll be discussing 2000's American Psycho.
There are no more barriers to cross. All I have in common with the uncontrollable and the insane, the vicious and the evil, all the mayhem I have caused and my utter indifference toward it, I have now surpassed. My pain is constant and sharp, and I do not hope for a better world for anyone. In fact, I want my pain to be inflicted on others. I want no one to escape. But even after admitting this, there is no catharsis. My punishment continues to elude me, and I gain no deeper knowledge of myself. No new knowledge can be extracted from my telling. This confession has meant nothing.
In New York City in 1987, a handsome young urban professional, aka Yuppie, Patrick Bateman, played by Christian Bale, lives a second life as a gruesome serial killer by night. He has run-ins with a detective, played by Willem Dafoe, his fiancée, played by Reese Witherspoon, his co-worker and assistant, Chloe Sevigny, and another co-worker, Jared Leto. It's a satire that's filled with violence and high society.
Yes. And today on the show, it is not only the final episode of the series, we also have a special guest on the show, and his name is Jeff Malone. Jeff, say hi to everyone.
Hi to everyone.
Very good. Jeff, so you, well, I've known you for a very long time.
Yeah, about, 15 years, I'd say?
Wow. Yeah, I guess it would be kind of crazy. You also are getting into the podcast game, I hear.
Yeah. It's something I've been meaning to do for a while, but it's a show that I'm hosting with my Aunt Beth.
And tell everyone the name of the show.
It's called That's AUNTertainment. As opposed to That's Entertainment. But,
and I've just learned this right before we started recording.
Shout out to Aunt Beth.
Yes, I mean, I'm going to tune in.
Awesome.
So it's you and Aunt Beth discussing pop culture, things that are going on in the entertainment industry, I'm assuming, things like of that nature, I guess?
Right, we're picking a one pop culture topic per episode. Our first episode is about the Emmys, and then we discuss like our earliest memories about that topic and our favorite memories and our current thoughts about it.
Cool. Yeah, so check that out when it premieres. You actually have not premiered the first episode yet as of recording. You may have once this airs, but definitely check that out. It's called That's AUNTertainment. AUNT Entertainment.
Correct.
All right. Now, let's talk some American Psycho. Jeff, I guess since you're our guest, what were your first impressions? I don't know had you seen the film before?
Yeah, this was my second time seeing it, but I think it might be my first time seeing it in full. The first time I saw it was about 10 years ago when I was in college. My roommates had it on, and I think I joined them maybe like 10 minutes in. Mm-hmm. It was maybe like...
It's a hell of a movie to walk into.
Yeah, well, I think like one of the first scenes I saw was the business card scene. And I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to keep watching. Like, whatever else I'd been doing, I dropped.
What were your first, like, I guess, watching it all the way through? I mean, what did you take away from it that you wanted to talk about, I guess?
Well, the first thing that was really noticeable that I hadn't thought about before was the scene when they go out to the club in the beginning, mm-hmm. and Patrick insults the bartender and mm-hmm. calls her a bitch, among other things, and she has zero reaction to it, which
becomes a theme in the film.
Yeah, very much so.
Miscommunication, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I don't think I'd seen that scene the first time I watched it, but seeing it now, in light of the way the movie ends, it was felt like the flashbacks at the end of Sixth Sense, where you go see, oh, this is why everyone seemed to be ignoring Bruce Willis. I'm like, maybe she's ignoring him, maybe the bartender is ignoring Patrick because he didn't actually say those things.
Well, also, Patrick is so blatantly, I mean, he's pretty upfront about being an asshole and being completely vain and, empty. And I mean, as are the others around him that he works with and, in that same world. But obviously it does ramp up a bit towards the end. But we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. But I mean, one thing I wanted to start off by discussing with this movie, and there's a lot to dig into. First thing I wanted to mention was just the way I really appreciate the way that dark comedy is used, the way it blends this with the horror elements. Jeff, you mentioned the business card scene, and throughout the film, I mean, there's many allusions to just that kind of vain emptiness and the people on Wall Street and just how they're concerned with the superficiality of things. And I think the business card really accentuates that point. So you have that scene where they're all comparing the business cards, and I think that's one of the best scenes in the movie, and it's a great way to show the shallowness, the superficialities of these characters, just the slight differences between the cards, and the reactions.
I mean, they're basically the same card. They're pretty much
exactly.
pretty much. There's very subtle little differences that to the naked eye, a graphic designer might notice, but you're a standard. Your average person who is not in an industry where they're making business cards is probably not going to notice an M-boss versus a D-boss. It's one of those. But it's so, and that's something I think kind of carries throughout the movie is, because to me it's interesting because talking about first impressions, I saw this movie for the first time in high school, and the first time I watched it, I saw it strictly as a horror film. I just don't think I kind of was old enough.
I did too, actually, when I first saw it.
I just don't think I had enough kind of worldly experience to understand that this was supposed to be funny. And now watching it again years later, and I've seen it a few times since then. I've probably seen this movie 4 or 5 times. To me, it plays mostly as a comedy. Like, obviously there are some pretty gruesome moments, but for the most part, it's even the opening scene, which is something I had totally forgotten until a more recent rewatch, where the opening shots of the movie is this, it looks like blood dripping on this white surface, and then you realize it's just this image. Really high-end cuisine, but with this horror music, and right from the beginning, it basically is telling you it's going to seem scary and crazy, but it's really kind of not what it seems. It's really a joke, it's really a critique, it's really satire.
Yeah, definitely. We've talked previously, Jeremy, about tone. We talked about that with Return to Oz. I mean, we've talked about that a lot in the show, I feel like. And with this film, because we've talked about how difficult it can be to maintain a consistent tone or to be able to manipulate that tone. And this film, I think, does a great job of establishing and maintaining its tone, and I think to the point where you find yourself laughing during a brutal murder scene. And I'm thinking specifically of the Hip to Be Square, Huey Lewis in the news scene. I mean, that's just so absurd and so over the top. But then the very next scene, he's it goes from one extreme to the other. It's like the most brutal, horrific scene goes from that to him getting his laundry or him just at the spa or something like that. And I think that's in a way what makes the movie work. In a strange way.
Well, and I think something that's interesting, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this, is to me Patrick Bateman is actually the most human character in this story, in a weird way, because he at least from the ones that we see, because he at least looks inward. The moment, actually, it's in the scene you were just talking about, or right after he commits this brutal Hip to Be a Square murder, he's carrying the body around, and he runs into one of his coworkers, and his coworker is like, "Where did you get that bag?" He's not questioning that there's a human body sized bag just being dragged around.
Even the night watchman doesn't even notice.
It's where did you get that bag? And everyone throughout the film is so shallow, and it feels like Patrick Bateman is the only one who's questioning it, which I think is kind of interesting because talking about tone, but also just crafting character, it's tough to make a character like that likable. You know, he's just totally relentless. I mean, he kills a puppy in this movie in the first half hour, and he's
stomps
still
on it. Yeah,
he's still probably the most likable character, which is
yeah, and that's partly due to Christian Bale's performance, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more. But the way he plays the character is so pitch perfect, I think. It's also the rare film that's seen through the villain's point of view, as it was in the original novel, which we'll also talk about in a bit. But so the film does a good job of somehow still maintaining a lot of mystery about who Patrick Bateman really is, to the point where, it's like, does Patrick Bateman even know who Patrick Bateman is? And a lot of times...
Is there a Patrick Bateman?
Exactly. Does he even exist? And a lot of times it's what they don't show in this movie that I find is really interesting. And like when he's... there's a really quick scene where Patrick Bateman's walking, and there's a woman at a crosswalk, and as soon as the sign turns to walk, the scene cuts away, and it just goes right to a laundromat scene where he's arguing about the removal of a rather large red stain. So it's like, it's left to your imagination, but you can kind of infer. But there's a lot of that going on in this movie, and I really appreciate that. And also the fact that it is seen from the quote-unquote villain's perspective, a bad person's perspective, which is funny because the Joker film that just came out, I have not seen that yet.
I just saw
Jeff,
it.
I don't.
Yeah.
You did see it? Okay, Jeff, did you see that movie?
I have seen it, yeah.
Okay, so I'm the only one who hasn't seen it yet, but I'm sure there's some correlation there.
A little bit.
Yeah,
a little bit.
I mean, he's in pre-villain mode. He fully embraces his villainy, I guess,
he's
by
leading
the
up
end.
to it.
But yeah, it's more we see him as a victim, early on.
Patrick Bateman's not a victim. Patrick Bateman is as far from a victim.
He has victims.
He might be a victim of circumstance a little bit, because he's like the son of the person who runs the investment firm, and he's kind of been thrust into this life. But he's by no means someone who society has kicked aside. He's victimized because he can't get a reservation at a really expensive restaurant, not because he can't afford to keep his lights on, or because he's not kicked around.
I mean, he's a victim in the sense that any man is a victim of the expectations of masculinity.
Exactly.
Oh, definitely. You hit it right on the head there. And I think that's really what this movie's about. I mean, well, one of the things it's about, it's also about, obviously, like 80s greed, emphasis on capitalism and conservatism. There's a lot of that. And, of course, in the last scene, you see Reagan on the TV and, giving his speech, and kind of ties everything together. But I like that they didn't go too heavily into, like, when the movie was set, the time period. There's, like, glimpses of that, and there's hints of it, but it's not really in your face too much, which I appreciated.
Yeah.
So this film was based on a novel by Bret Easton Ellis, and I have read a lot of his books. I have read this one. And I was a big fan of it when I read it. It came out in '91, and it was somewhat of a it was quite controversial, as you would expect, maybe. But I don't think I realized how controversial it was until I started reading up on it.
Oh yeah, it was very publicized.
People were really up in arms about it, just mostly because of the descriptions of the the brutal slayings and the misogyny, and I think a lot of people don't realize, like with the film, I think people don't realize that it is a social commentary, and it is a satire, and all of that. And there's that black humor. A lot of people just take it at face value, but there's that subtext. I think that's what's important to understand, and I think that's what makes it what it is. And I think the film does a great job. Jeff, did you read the novel by any chance?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so I think the film does a great job of taking that, because the novel's written in a first-person narrative, and so it's written from Patrick Bateman's point of view,
which is probably why it was controversial. If it's an objective, cold story about this happening, then it's just true crime. But when it's written in the first person, then all of a sudden it asks the reader to put themselves in the shoes of this person.
Yeah.
Kind of like the movie does. There are a lot of POV shots in this movie, which I never really noticed until this most recent viewing.
Yeah, lots of scenes of like the back of his head when he's talking to someone, kind of like a Citizen Kane kind of thing as well. Yeah. Or
even people looking right down the barrel in conversation, like the scene where he's picking up. I forget the character's name, but there's a scene where he's picking up the prostitute. and the car is kind of moving, and when she's talking to him, when the camera's pointed at him, it's kind of 3/4, even maybe pushing a little bit more towards profile. And when the camera's on her, she's talking right directly down the barrel of the camera. So we're like totally subjective camera in his shoes.
Right. And a lot of the reason for that actually is, well, I told Jeremy before we started recording that I listened to the commentary right before we recorded this. I had seen the film a couple times, probably like at least 3 or 4 times, but I hadn't seen it in a while, so I rewatched it with the commentary and with Mary Herron, and who we want to talk about a little bit because a big part of this series is one-hit wonders, people that filmmakers that made a movie that connected and it was kind of a big thing, and at least in the cult world, and that's pretty much what they're known for. And I would definitely say that she's known for this film, although she did make I Shot Andy Warhol before this, and she has a decent number of films like Notorious Betty Page and things like that. But I think it's safe to say that American Psycho would be what she's known for, and I think she did a great job taking that first person narrative and not only marrying it with some really striking visuals, but also she talked about in the commentary about how there's a lot of victims are women in this movie, and she tried to see a lot of the brutal murders, like she tried to see it from the woman's perspective in a way. So I think a lot of what you're talking about, Jeremy, is how it's shot, and I think it does kind of give it, even though it's from Bateman's perspective, you're kind of seeing it through other people's eyes in a lot of the scenes. I think it's pretty cool.
Well, and I think when we actually started getting into the real, like the lead up to the violence, I think is kind of through his perspective. But once we actually start getting into the violence, it becomes a lot more objective or through their perspective. Because I think it would have been, I think that kind of helped it keep this idea of critique. Because the murders, the murder with the with what's his name, Allen, what's the coworker, Paul Allen,
Paul Allen
murder,
Paul Allen, yeah,
that one is funny, and the ones like a lot of the murders of the men are kind of funny because they're viewed as this bravado kind of jealous thing, but when
they're all the same playing field,
but when it's the women, they're not played as funny in the movie. I haven't read the book. I could imagine that some of the controversy may have come from the fact that, and knowing, I've read, the only Bret Easton Ellis book I've read is Less Than Zero, but I've listened to his podcast a bit because he's had some guests who I'm really fond of, and he, personality-wise, he's very provocative, and he can be kind of cold sometimes, not in a way of critiquing him cold, but to prove a point, he can be kind of cold and rigid in the way he goes about proving a point, and almost have a feeling sometimes of detachment. And I could imagine that maybe in the book, and you would be able to back this up or refute it, Mark, that maybe some of these murders with these women, he had that kind of detached, distant, more objectively cold feeling towards.
You actually hit it right on the head, because I was reading some quotes from him about this book, and he didn't really talk about it for a while after it came out because of all the controversy surrounding it. He kind of just stayed away from it, which actually is kind of interesting if you know him at all. But
very interesting.
But more recently, he has come out and spoken about it, and actually I was very interested to hear him talk about it because he said that it's very, very personal, this book, and because a lot of people think he just went, sat down and wrote this like kind of high concept Wall Street person who is committing murders, which is like a very good idea, for a book. But he said that it came more from just like him looking at himself, and he said he was slipping into this consumerist void. That was supposed to be giving him confidence, but really just made him feel worse and worse about himself. And he said that's where the tension of American Psycho comes from, and I found that very interesting. So even though it's high concept, it's very personal to him. And I think Mary Herron took that, and like I said, I think she just did a fantastic job with it. Jeff, what did you think about the way the movie looks and the way scenes were shot? Like, do you think it was, well executed?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, the parts that are really striking are especially the scenes where Patrick is going on about his favorite music. I mean,
I wanted to bring that up because I know you're a big music guy, Jeff. Patrick Bateman's, he seems to connect with popular music in a certain way.
Yeah, well, he's very much sticking up for the art of the what's really the poppiest of pop music, and pointedly so, because he talks about
Phil Collins.
his love of Genesis and Phil Collins, and he'll say before Phil Collins joined the band, their stuff was too artsy for my taste. So, yeah, but I will definitely go to bat for the artistic merits of someone who's a true pop artist, as Patrick Bateman would. But I also like the weirder artsy stuff that he isn't as big a fan of. But
But you think that says a lot about his character, just the fact that he has these monologues about it. It seems like almost the only time he's actually passionate about anything is when he's talking about these pop artists and certain songs, and like he talks about Whitney Houston in the one scene, almost has like a spiritual moment. It's. What do you think that says about his character?
It reminds me a bit of a lot of Hannibal Lecter, especially the Mads Mikkelsen version on the Hannibal TV show, where you've got a psycho killer who's also someone who's very much into aesthetic pleasures. And I think there were a few shots of food in American Psycho, lovingly shot, that reminded me of the Hannibal TV show.
That's funny. I love, personally, I really love to go back to the Whitney Houston thing a bit. I really love that scene. I think that anytime, there's a couple things with descriptions and the way Patrick Bateman describes things. I like to read food reviews in the New Yorker. And Patrick Bateman, it sounds like any restaurant he's talking about, he has ripped the verbiage straight from a review. It's that's not how people normally talk about food or music. It's like it's how someone who's writing, their 400 words on that thing would describe it. Like there's one thing where he's talking to the Willem Dafoe character, and he's talking about some play he had seen, and he describes it as a laugh riot. Which is such a bizarre way of speaking.
Because who actually says that, right?
Yeah, like no one actually says, "Oh, it's a laugh riot" to a police officer. But what I love the Whitney Houston scene because the thing that he's so impressed by isn't necessarily the music itself. It's the fact that she's had 4 #1 singles, which means that she's had success, and the thing that he is thrilled with, and the thing that his whole life is kind of consumed by, is this idea of conforming and being as much like everyone else as possible. But I love that when he's talking about how he loves Whitney Houston, there's the woman there who's getting kind of tipsy and maybe drugged, and she's like, "You listen to Whitney Houston? You actually have a Whitney Houston CD?" And it just breaks him, because it's like, even though he's into the popular thing, he can still be judged for it. Even though he's done his research, he can, and there's just this little moment where he just gives her this look where he's just totally flabbergasted.
And that's all it takes. It's just like a switch that goes off. It's like, now she's gonna be murdered. It's just one little thing, one little imperfection, or one, just something against him, and he really is truly a psycho in this film. And whether or not it's imagined or not, I think either way, it's just like his performance, the way Christian Bale plays his character. He takes a character who borders on essentially a cartoon character. Like, he's so over the top. Yeah. But he gives him such an underlying depth that I didn't even really realize before until I rewatched it. And just like what's going on in his face. There's like so many little things like in one scene that can happen on his face. It's just really amazing.
I saw a piece of information that said when Christian Bale was doing research on this movie, he was kind of feeling stuck with the character, and he saw a clip of Tom Cruise on a talk show, and thought it was amazing.
Was it the Oprah Winfrey Show? Was it Oprah?
Maybe. I think it might have been pre the Oprah.
I think I've heard about this. I think it was on Letterman, actually.
Letterman, yeah. And it was something about how he was so enthusiastic outwardly, but to Christian Bale, he felt like there was nothing behind his eyes.
Oh wow.
Which I just thought was kind of an interesting thing, and that's not a critique of Tom Cruise. I think that's just the feeling that a lot of entertainers have when they're having to go through the talk show route, where they're having to promote something that they've already put all of their artistic passion into, and then they're kind of done with it, but still have to act like they're excited about it, even though they moved on. And I think that's kind of Patrick Bateman in a nutshell. Is there's nothing he's really excited about, but he, he has to outwardly, even like down to him talking about how we have to save the children, we have to stand up for feminism, like him giving his little social critique of everything everyone has to do better. And if you just heard that person speaking, you would think that they were actually passionate about these things. But like we know that he's not, which is actually a really common thing. Particularly I living in New York City, I bump up against people pretty regularly, not who are necessarily Patrick Bateman types, but who, because New York
I hope
is
not.
Well, maybe they are, I don't know, but New York is is a bit of a microcosm in the sense that everything is so connected and ground level, and the richest people bump up against the poorest. So there is this idea where everyone is constantly trying to put on a front, so they, for lack of a better term, fit in. Not as much now as the Reagan '80s. I think now it's a little more overrun by hipsters, which isn't an insult. I think it's definitely better than the Reagan '80s.
But there's still that certain type of isolation that we see in this film, you think?
Yeah, and performance.
Like,
it's very performative.
Yeah, right. Like unable to connect with others while living amongst so many other people, and that definitely comes across in this film for sure. And just a couple takeaways from that commentary. I'm not going to harp on it too long. The commentary from Mary Harron, the director, is actually, it's from 2005, so it's probably the same one from the DVD. But some of the things if you're interested at all in this film, if you're listening to this, definitely check out that commentary. If you're into film commentaries, it's a very good one. And one of the things she says in the beginning is that this film she said it's a comedy of mistaken identity, which is an interesting way to look at it, because there is a lot of mistaken identity going on in the film. People get other people's names wrong. They mistake people for other people. I mean, it happens throughout the film. And that says a lot about just that culture and how everyone is striving to be the same and look the same. And I think the scene where he puts on the facial mask in for the very beginning when it's going through his morning routine, and this is actually what she says as well, is that the scene where he puts on the facial mask is what best sums up the film. That's what she said as well, and I thought that when I was watching it. But and also just some other things she brought up that I didn't even notice. So they never actually show Patrick Bateman or anyone else doing any work at all.
Yeah,
which is so obvious now that I think about it. But and that was the same thing as in the book. But it's just this act that it's all facade. Like his social and his romantic life it's all just for show. You just see him hanging out, listening to music. He never actually does anything. Which
one thing with that I just noticed for the first time in this most recent viewing is the scene when the detective comes into his office, the Willem Dafoe character. He just pretends to be on the phone doing business because he doesn't want to give the appearance that he's not. He wants rather to give the appearance that he's doing something productive at all times, despite the fact that he's literally just sitting there. He's doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah, he even sheepishly puts his headphones in the drawer, like he just sweeps it into the drawer and closes it, and so he doesn't want him to see it. Yeah, it's funny. It's just very all these little things just really add up in this movie.
I mean, I just in the moment of watching that, I didn't even interpret that as he's trying to make it seem like he's working. It seems like I was just conditioned to think oh, detective's coming in. He wants to not seem suspicious, so he's talking to someone for whatever reason, this conversation is going to establish that he's not a suspect in the disappearance of Paul Allen. And then you hear what he's saying, and I'm like, why the hell is he talking about this stuff? What the hell's the point of that?
Yeah, he's telling someone how to book a restaurant reservation or something. It's the most useless conversation.
That's him working, apparently.
Yeah, and then he's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Oh, just some business."
Right, exactly. And the last thing I'll bring up, two other things I'll bring up from the commentary, just because I found them interesting for our conversation. Mary Harron said that one of her favorite films is Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, a Buñuel film. Have you seen that as well, Jeff?
Oh yeah, that might be my favorite foreign movie of all time.
Oh yeah, it's great. Jeremy, have you seen that one?
I actually have not. I've seen a few other Buñuel films, and that one has been
Okay.
on my list
Yeah.
forever, but I have
Well,
not seen
when
it
she
yet.
brought that up, yeah, it definitely made sense because it's a very surreal film about, well, obviously the bourgeoisie, but the upper middle class,
Hmm.
and just ignoring certain things. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot. When she said that, it just all kind of came together for me. And also another
That
quote that she's, sorry, what was that?
well, that's a movie about just constantly trying to eat
Yes,
dinner as
trying to eat
well.
dinner, right? Exactly, yeah. And just ignoring what's going on around you, pretty much.
Yeah.
Um, and then the last thing I'll bring up that she said is, she said, "Nothing can come from within because there is no within." In reference to Bateman, like she's talked about how everything he knows, he learns from videotapes. You know, like he's always talking about returning videotapes.
Yeah.
And I just thought
Wait,
that was a very good quote that she said. It's kind of sums up his character a little bit.
he's
Yeah.
manufactured. I think
Right.
is like ultimately his
Mhm.
whole existence, and he says it right in the beginning. There is no Patrick Bateman. There's just the idea
Yeah.
of Patrick Bateman, and like so, which is interesting because he's self aware enough to know that.
Yeah,
Which,
you
Yeah.
can sense him fighting it a little bit, and as the film progresses, you do see more and more of that.
yeah.
The big confession scene, when he's confessing to his lawyer on the phone,
Mhm.
and then walking up to him afterwards and just like pleading with him, like I did these things, I killed these people,
Yeah.
and
Well,
he just
it almost seems like
receives
he
no
is
punishment.
trying to find some kind of humanity in it all,
Hmm.
which is I'm trying to think what it is. I saw another film recently that I was thinking about the exact same thing, where it's just someone. It might be Under the Silver Lake. Have either
Okay.
of you seen that movie?
No, I haven't seen it.
Worth checking out. That I think that's gonna end
I
up
have
being
seen it.
yeah, gonna end up being a cult film eventually.
Okay.
But it's yeah, but I think that Bateman is just searching for like he's kind of searching for meaning in a weird way,
Yeah.
but like not really finding it in
Mhm.
any kind of meaningful way. It's like
Right.
he's searching for meaning in ways he thinks that he should search for meaning, maybe based on movies he's seen and music he listens to.
Hmm.
Uh, but like ultimately, it's all hollow and empty and rather pointless.
Yeah. And you don't know anything about his family or,
Yeah, except that
I
his
mean, he had.
dad is
Well, yeah.
some kind of
that's
executive.
that's how he got his job. Yeah.
Hmm.
And he has a fiance played by Reese Witherspoon, but it's interesting because there's zero affection shown between either of them.
Hmm.
All their scenes, I don't think they even go near each other. They definitely don't touch each other.
Yeah,
They don't. They
Um,
seem to be having completely different conversations.
Oh,
whenever they're
definitely.
together.
different lives.
Definitely.
They're like they
Yeah.
really are not involved. Which that's why I was thinking about the scene when he breaks up with her, and she
Mhm.
starts crying.
Or tries to. Yeah.
Or tries to, and she starts
Mm-hmm.
crying, and that I thought was one of the most interesting moments in the film, because I
Mhm.
was thinking about like why was she crying, because it doesn't seem like she's actually really invested in him, and my conclusion, and I'd be curious to hear what both of you think, is that she was crying because people would find out about it, and
Mhm.
it was almost more of like a status thing where it's like once again this idea
Yep.
of performative. I recently read the book The Bonfire of the Vanities. I don't know if
Okay.
either of you have gotten to dig into that or see the movie. The book
I
is
have not.
better than the movie in my opinion.
Okay.
But it's the same thing, kind of set on Wall Street. And one thing I read it as part of a book club, and one thing we kept discussing is this idea of performative behavior amongst
Mhm.
the super rich. And I
Mhm.
think that that's what it is for her. Like when they just have that much money to burn, it's all about what restaurant you go to, who has the nicest business card. For her being broken up with, like it's not that the relationship is ending that she's upset about. It's the fact that she's now going to be the person who got broken up with.
Hmm. I think it's exactly what you said. I think it's social status. Losing that is what makes her cry in that scene. It makes her have, yeah, because it's. I mean, their relationship is not existent as far as what we can see from the film. But yeah, I think it's just all just the status. What all these characters are about is status essentially. But I
Yeah.
mean, Jeff, how'd you take that scene?
I mean, well, that seems like the simplest explanation that it's a status thing. I mean, in this setting, in this world, that seems like that would have to be the explanation. But it's what's weird is that it takes her a few beats to get to that reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Like, first she basically ignores him or doesn't even hear what he's saying. Then she thinks he's joking, and he has to, like, just beat that reaction out of her, basically.
Right.
Um, to, you know, like, he has to be as forceful as possible to actually to get her to hear it. And I'm like, okay, I guess it's a status thing, but I'm almost like, it's like just like a physiological reaction at that point. Like, that's just, like, her body's just acting on instinct.
Right.
Like, I should be, her tear
Yeah.
ducts know I should be
Yeah.
upset when this happens. But it's
Right.
also, it's a pretty similar scene to Legally Blonde, which comes out just a year later, which
I've not seen Legally Blonde.
well, that one of the, like, 5 minutes into it, that starts off with a character played by Reese Witherspoon getting broken up with when she thinks she's about to get engaged, and she's the guy she's with is, you know, it's like someone who she thinks she's supposed to marry, as he's on his way to become a senator, and she'll be there right by his side.
Oh, it's very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all the performances are pretty. They're all vague in just the right way in this
Yep.
film. So yeah, I mean, I feel like we discussed a lot about the film. Right now, I just wanted to go to both of you and see. We sometimes talk about, you know, what scenes stood out from the film or what stuck with us. Jeremy, do you want to just go first?
Yeah, so it wasn't even a particular scene that stood out to me, and it was kind of an intertextual thing, but there's one shot kind of later on in the film, I believe it's right before Bateman goes on, like, his big killing spree, and he's just walking in downtown Manhattan, and in the background you just see the Twin Towers, just, like, kind of looming large over him, and I think that moment just kind of stood out to me, just thinking about the fact that this movie came out just before 9/11, and how different
Yeah.
the world of kind of yuppie culture was right after that. And so, like, in a
Right.
way, like, I think the context of this movie kind of changes after that event, because that attack basically was on Wall Street. You know, that's where it happened. I think it
Yeah.
might have even implied that they were working in the Twin Towers in this movie at some point. I could be wrong about
Oh,
that.
really? Okay.
Because there's one point, like, when he's running in the buildings, and he goes in, like, two separate buildings at the end. I could be wrong about
okay.
that, though. But either way, or even if it's not where he's working, they're right there. And this idea where it's like, it was such a kind of niche little thing. You know, you had this yuppie culture in the 80s, and I guess a little bit into the early 90s. But then, you know, 9/11 happened, and then the recession happened, and now you go from a culture where these guys are kind of, like, praised as heroes, like the greed is good Reagan culture, to post 9/11 and post recession, where these guys basically become the villains in our culture in a way. So for me, it wasn't
Right.
necessarily even so
Very
much a
interesting,
thing
yeah.
about the movie itself, but just the context of what the movie would end up meaning, and maybe also why it ended up kind of becoming a cult film, because it kind of
Right,
was
definitely.
it made
Yeah.
it feel more distant, because that was a society and a culture that could no longer exist in the way it had.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's one of those films that I think gets better as it ages, actually, and you get more perspective, and for sure, I think it's part of the reason it is a cult film. Jeff, did any moments? Do you have any favorite moments or any scenes that stood out to you from this film? There's probably a lot of them.
Yeah, one small but kind of significant thing I didn't notice while I was watching, but I was like just kind of brought to my attention when I was just like reading up afterwards, was all the food that they mention at the restaurants that they go to. It's nonsensical or inedible, and I didn't even realize it at the time. Like, they're talking about it so fast and speaking about it like it's
Like
completely
peanut
normal.
soup
Like,
with
yeah, like red
Well, I think-
snapper. Yeah, mud soup with charcoal arugula is one of them. And
I'm pretty
those-
sure it's it's been a while since I read the book, but I'm pretty sure there are actual chapters in the book that are just descriptions of menus.
That's
Like,
fantastic.
just passages of just descriptions of foods and different restaurants and stuff like that. So they definitely got that across in the film.
But that's a very real thing, because like I said, like New Yorker reviews, it was
Yeah.
one of my favorite things in the whole magazine is the food reviews, and sometimes there'll be food that you read about in there, and you're like, it's like that, like I would rather just eat a cheeseburger, like that's like that's like a $95 plate of the most disgusting combination of food you could possibly think of.
Well, Jeff, you live in New York too, so I'm sure you've seen your fair share. You're actually in Brooklyn as well. That's funny.
I mean, yeah, I feel like I still read about it more than I actually see it. I mean,
Yeah.
if you want to, halal food carts are plenty
Yeah.
weird enough for me.
Yeah.
To
Agreed.
yeah.
I think those
I-
kind of menus are reserved for a certain type of people who
Yeah.
have a certain income.
Yeah.
Exactly. That says it. I think the restaurants say it all in
Yeah.
this film. Yeah. So I mean, I think we've said pretty much. I mean, a lot can be said about this movie, but I feel like we said a lot about it already, and I feel like I guess one of the criticisms that could be said about this film is that there is a certain lack of progression. Which I think used to bother me more, but I think watching it more recently, if you're just taking it as it is and kind of rolling with it, and also I feel like in some way that is the point of the film, because things kind of repeat and there's almost like a circle, like a circular cycle to things. But I feel like you do start to see a bit of Patrick's descent into an all-out psychopath. Like you see him trying to leave his fiance, you see him confessing to people. There's explosions, which I actually completely forgot about. There's a police shootout, which I completely forgot about. So it does escalate a little bit, but I think maybe a reason this is a cult film and not a mainstream film is because it is so hallucinatory, and it's continually feeds on itself, and it's almost like a loop. It just keeps going. It's like a murder scene followed by a scene at a restaurant. It's but in a way, that's what makes it so dreamlike and so special.
With
and
no real
so,
transition between the two.
No,
You're
and that's
just
what's
in
so
one or the
jarring
other.
about it.
Yeah.
It was definitely intentional. I mean, from listening to that commentary, it was certainly intentional, and I think it works for sure. But that aside, I think it is a great film and a great adaptation of a novel that may have been almost impossible to adapt, I think, because of the way it is written, and the notions that people had about it, the misconceptions about it. But I think they did a fantastic job with it. But I want to get your final thoughts. Jeff, do you want to give your final thoughts on American Psycho?
Yeah, I guess I'll say, so the first time I watched it, when the moment that Patrick's lawyer says, I just had dinner with, was it lunch or was it dinner with Paul Allen in
I don't think it
London.
matters.
Yeah, it's not important. So at that moment, the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, it was all in his head.
Right.
But there's an interview from a while back, probably close to the, well, I'm not sure exactly when it was, but it was Mary Herron and maybe some other people involved with the movie were on Charlie Rose, and she kind of lamented that she wanted it to be more, the ending to be more ambiguous. Like she thought the way it turned out, it really does seem to be saying that it was all the killings were in Patrick's head, but it was meant to be ambiguous. And Bret Easton Allen said one of the reasons it shouldn't be filmed is because it's harder to show that ambiguity on film. But I think seeing it again and having that perspective in mind, I think it works either way. If you say it was all in his head, or if it did actually happen, and everyone just inexplicably ignored all these deaths.
Yeah.
Either
Either way, this character is having a breakdown.
right, and it's and either
in
way,
some way or another.
either way, it's well. I think if it did actually happen, then you have the added meaning of what it says about society, that
Right.
people ignore that all these yuppies are interchangeable, and all the women who die are the type of people who are ignored by society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. I thought one thing that in that ending too, which I don't know why, because like I said, the first time I saw this, I kind of thought of it more as a horror movie, which is why I guess my mind didn't go to the place where maybe it was all in his head. Because as a horror movie, like that's kind of like the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
That takes all the
Right.
horror out. So I didn't even think of that. The first time I saw it, I remember, and I think kind of at least for me, the ending I kind of would like it to be, and how I guess because it's ambiguous, it is for me, is that like you said, like these guys are interchangeable, but also just this idea that like no one is even paying enough attention to anyone else to know who like belongs to what name, and like he could have done all these murders, and like the guy he murdered wasn't even Paul Allen.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it could have just been some other dude,
Right.
and like Paul
right.
Allen was actually the real Paul Allen was in London or at the casino or what. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like it's
Paul
like,
Allen could still be alive somewhere.
yeah,
right?
Paul
because
Allen
it's like,
founded Microsoft.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like,
Apparently, that's where they got the name from.
yeah, because if people can mix up Bateman for other people, then why can't
Yeah.
Bateman mix up Paul Allen?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like
Is-
no
is-
one really.
Is Bateman even Bateman? I mean, we don't even really know. Like, but that's why I think it's so cool about the movie. It's like no matter how many times you watch it, because it is such a cult film, it's you never really get those answers, and it's
Yeah.
kind of cool in a way. That just that vagueness, and I think that adds a lot to the dark comedy of it as well.
Absolutely.
Like a comedy of errors, and it's a very psychotic version of it. So yeah, I mean that mixed with the imagery, we didn't really talk about much of the imagery, but just like a naked Christian Bale running down a hallway with the chain,
Chainsaw,
dripping
yeah.
in blood with a chainsaw. Yeah, that's an image everyone knows from this film, and yeah, and that's why people think of it as a horror movie. But like as we mentioned, there's a lot of comedy going on as well, and I think with repeated viewings, that comedy comes out more and more.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's definitely a cult film for sure, and worthy of this series. And I think it's a great one to wrap up this series. A flash in the can. Jeremy, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's
think it's a
definitely a
suitable ending.
wacky note to wrap it up on for sure.
Yeah,
One of the cultier
went out with a bang.
cult films.
Yeah.
Yeah, went out with a bang for this series for sure.
All right. Well, I guess that's going to do it for us today. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for having me.
You're our second ever guest,
Oh boy,
so we're new at this, but we hope we were courteous.
I felt
and,
welcome.
Welcoming. Great.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. And that's AUNTertainment.
Yes,
check it
correct.
out.
It will most likely. When's this episode dropping? Do you think?
I have no idea.
Well, the first episode of That's AUNTertainment will most likely be dropping before this episode does. Probably sometime in October.
Most likely.
Yes.
That's a safe call. All right. Well, definitely check that out. And hopefully we'll have you back again sometime.
I'll put that on my some random point in the future
Sounds
schedule.
great. Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. Put it in your hypothetical calendar.
Correct.
So, Jeremy, just to conclude our series here on One Hit Wonders, Flash in the Can. So we inadvertently chose films from different decades. Each film that we talked about was in the next consecutive decades. So we talked about starting from the 60s, went to 70s, 80s, 90s, and we ended with American Psycho in 2000. So yeah, we hit a lot of them there.
Yeah.
So that wasn't really planned, but it's kind of cool looking back. We saw a particular one-hit wonder cult film from each decade. And Jeremy, I mean, what do you think about what we investigated here?
Well, I think what's really valuable, the lesson I took away more than anything else, particularly, as a filmmaker and film lover, I think it gets very easy sometimes to keep going back to the same directors over and over again. Particularly the ones who have kind of been canonized, which, not to knock them or anything, but, we so regularly hear about a Scorsese. We so regularly hear about, a Coppola or an Orson Welles or these big directors. And of course, their movies are wonderful, absolutely amazing, worth studying every second. I personally watch as many as I can, as many times as I can.
Right.
But I do think there's also something to be said about trying to find
loss.
these people who maybe haven't either had the opportunity or just haven't gotten the recognition. Especially because, so my background, I went to school for graphic design. And with graphic design, I had to take a lot of art history classes and actually was able to get an art history minor. So I'm a really, I would consider myself a little bit of an art historian and film historian. And I think that other mediums, painting, sculpture, photography, we all have processes in place at this point for preserving them because they've been around longer. There are very strict procedures in place for what to do with a 500-year-old painting and how to make sure that it gets taken care of and recognized. Whereas with film, it's still a new medium and we're learning, the film preservation is growing as a field. But especially now in the digital age, it's like a painting is a physical object, but a film at this point is kind of an idea if something happens to those original prints, especially, and all we have is the digital versions left or something like that. And so particularly with directors who haven't been canonized, I just feel like it's so important to keep discussing these directors, keep looking at their work, talking about the anomalies, talk about how they've influenced us, share them with people, because if we don't, the films are going to go away. Film doesn't last forever. Fires happen, prints get lost, prints get damaged. So by talking about these little gems of these films and keeping them, in the public eye, I think, we can really, and it's not just people doing podcasts and film historians, it's every film viewer. We have an opportunity and I think a responsibility to share these films and talk about them.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, I've always been one for the outliers, for the outcasts, and I think we talked about some of them here. Well, we did and we didn't because, then we have Walter Murch, who is world-renowned. He's extremely famous and well-deservedly so in Hollywood. So, but, he made one that he made a film that just didn't work for one reason or another with people, and it didn't become what he hoped it would be. So you kind of see all different types of situations, but I think mostly it's what you're talking about, Jeremy. It's like the outliers. It's the ones, the filmmakers who maybe took a chance and maybe only got one chance, right? So we saw that a little bit as well, and maybe they only wanted one chance, like we saw with Herc Harvey with Carnival of Souls, how he made his one film, then he went back to directing training films, and he went back to another type of industry. So. So I think we've seen a lot of different types of stories in this series, and I think they're all worth looking into. And I think it also just shines a light that there are so many more out there. Obviously, we can't talk about all of them, but
there are so many, and
there are so many.
Definitely take some time and do some research and try to find. We'd love to hear from you if there are films that this is where we're concluding our series. But if there are films that we didn't talk about on here, I know we had a list of probably, what would you say, 15, 20 films.
Oh, we had to
we had a very long list, and
list.
these were the 5 we chose. But if you'd like some recommendations on one-hit wonder films, feel free to reach out. Or if you come across any that you think are valuable, definitely let us know, because we're happy to share it.
We could always do a follow-up, or we could definitely. We had a very long list of potential films to discuss for the series, but we try to whittle it down to at least usually around 5 to 6 films is usually what we go for each series. So we had to cut some of them, but I think the ones we talked about, I'm glad they were each from a different decade, because that was kind of cool that it worked out that way. And they were all worth watching, I'll say that. Absolutely. And worth discussing, so you never know, right? Thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Apparently, iTunes is not a thing anymore, so I will stop mentioning iTunes. But you can find us wherever you find your podcasts, wherever you're listening to us now. And if you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult, as Jeff has done, and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.